The killer's face turned white. A second ago he was laughing, reveling in his victory, and now he stood as if paralyzed, staring into the depths of the gilded cage. From there, from the bird's beak, came not a cry, but a cold, mocking female voice. The voice of his dead victim. Every word was pronounced with perfect diction. "And then, my clever Cortez, when he asks what you heard, you will say, 'Marcus. It was Marcus.'" In the dead silence of the living room, a sentence from the afterlife was pronounced, and I understood. This was not an investigation. This was a performance, directed by the deceased. And I was just the bait. The cab vanished around the bend before Adrian could second-guess himself. The rusted iron gates of the Belmont estate stood half open, like the mouth of a toothless crone inviting him into her withered depths. He adjusted his slipping glasses with his middle finger, a habitual gesture his hands made in moments of uncertainty, and stepped onto the drive. The world changed instantly. A mile-long avenue carved through a canopy of ancient oaks transformed the Louisiana afternoon into perpetual twilight. Tree branches interlaced overhead in dense lacework, through which sunlight penetrated only in rare, trembling droplets that scattered across the trampled earth. Spanish moss hung from every limb in gray beards, brushing Adrian's shoulders with phantom hands, leaving damp impressions on his tweed jacket. The air here thickened to the consistency of syrup, filled with the deafening drone of cicadas, a monotonous, hypnotic sound that seems to emanate not from insects but from the trees themselves, vibrating with ancient, hostile life. Adrian walked slowly, his long legs navigating with academic awkwardness over roots that bulged across the road like veins on the back of an aged hand. His leather satchel, stuffed with notebooks and pens, struck his hip with each step, marking a rhythm contrary to the chaotic singing of cicadas. He ran his palm through his disheveled, dark chestnut hair, contemplating how far this road had taken him, not physically, but existentially. From the quiet archives of the Newberry, smelling of paper and truth, to this tunnel of the dead and moss, leading to an estate whose name, Belmont, beautiful mountain, rang as mockery of any notion of elevation or grace. The estate appeared suddenly, like a vision from a fevered dream. The two-story structure, once painted ceremonial white, had peeled and cracked, exposing gray wood that resembled bones beneath decomposing skin. 4 massive columns supporting the broad veranda stood eroded at their bases by moisture and covered with green mold, as if gangrene were climbing their bodies. Wicker chairs cluttered the porch, one lying on its side, toppled by wind or indifference. A tarnished brass plaque beside the entrance bore the word Belmont in Gothic letters where time had erased several lines, transforming the words into illegible cipher. Adrian stopped at the foot of the steps. His gray-green eyes, the color of swamp water where untold stories drown, slid across the facade. Windows stared at him with empty sockets, reflecting only their own darkness. Somewhere deep within the house, a door slammed, a dull, final sound. He climbed the steps, his boots creaking on the rotted porch boards. The front door stood ajar. The smell hit first. A sweet, suffocating fragrance of wilting lilies mixed with the dense, almost tactile scent of centuries-old dust and lemon polish, creating the atmosphere of a crypt where air had remained undisturbed for too long. Adrian crossed the threshold into the foyer, and the coolness of the interior space enveloped his skin, contrasting with the sticky humidity outside. Beneath his feet, the parquet creaked, not welcomingly, but rather as warning. He didn't enter the house as a grieving relative. He entered as an archaeologist stepping into a tomb just unsealed, where every object bore the fingerprints of the dead. Voices drifted from the parlor to the right, loud, stripped of funeral softness. Adrian moved toward them, his silhouette, long, stooped, almost apologetic, sliding across a tarnished mirror in a gilded frame. He barely recognized himself in the reflection. A ghost in a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, too pale for a living person. The parlor greeted him with a visual cacophony of Victorian excess. Massive mahogany furniture, polished to a dull, almost oily sheen, filled the space with claustrophobic density. Sofas, dressers, tables, each piece seemed designed for giants rather than ordinary people. A faded Persian rug spread beneath his feet, its intricate pattern nearly worn away in the trodden places, leaving only ghostly hints of former magnificence. Portraits of ancestors in heavy, gilded frames stared from the walls, their eyes covered with a network of varnish cracks, watching the living with mute condemnation. But it wasn't the furniture that captured Adrian's attention. His family stood by the tall, arched windows overlooking the overgrown garden, their figures cut from the gray daylight like silhouettes of vultures appraising carrion. Marcus was speaking on the phone, his back turned to the entrance. His broad shoulders, clad in a sea-green polo shirt, tensed with each word. His voice boomed through the room, utterly devoid of respect for place or circumstance. "Listen, Carol, I'm not waiting 6 months for the will to clear probate. The land's worth $3 million minimum if we sell to the right buyer. There's a guy from Miami, a developer, ready to pay cash." Adrian froze in the doorway. 3 days. 3 days since Beatrice's death, and Marcus was already discussing the liquidation of her legacy with the same ease that market vendors debate the price of rotten vegetables. Caroline noticed him first. She stood by the fireplace, one hand casually touching the mantel, the other stroking a string of perfect pearls at her neck. A slow, almost ritualistic movement that betrayed not nervousness, but calculation. Her tall figure was draped in a dress of muted gray cashmere that cost more than Adrian's monthly salary. Blonde hair was arranged in an impeccable chignon, revealing a slender, aristocratic neck. When her gray eyes met his, something flickered in them. Not the joy of reunion, but appraisal. Her gaze slid over his worn jacket, wrinkled corduroy trousers, well-used satchel. The equation was calculated instantly. Adrian posed no financial threat. Adrian. Her voice was soft, insinuating, like velvet wrapped around a blade. She interrupted Marcus's conversation with a light touch on his elbow. He turned, cast one quick appraising glance of pale blue eyes at Adrian, and returned to the phone. "I'll call you back." He tossed into the receiver and disconnected. Caroline was already crossing the room, her movements smooth, controlled, each step a rehearsal of care. She extended her hand and touched Adrian's forearm with cold fingers. The contact was brief, but long enough to appear sincere to an outside observer. Adrian felt his body instinctively tense. "I'm so glad you could come," she said, her smile symmetrical, flawless, and utterly empty. "Beatrice loved you so much. She talked about you constantly." The lie slipped into the space between them with practiced ease. Beatrice had indeed loved him, but she had never been the sentimental woman who talked about someone constantly. She had been sharp, sarcastic, unpredictable, qualities Caroline despised as lack of control. "Thank you," Adrian replied quietly, his voice sounding duller than he expected. He adjusted his glasses that had slipped down his nose. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner." "Oh, don't blame yourself," Caroline waved away his words with the grace of a trained actress. "It happened so suddenly. No one could have foreseen it." Marcus approached them, his heavy gait making the floorboards groan. He stood a head taller than Adrian and half again as wide, his presence filling the space with animal assertiveness. His tanned face, with a reddish tint to the skin, betraying not health, but stress and alcohol, contorted into the semblance of a sympathetic grimace.
"Professor," he said, extending his hand. The handshake was too firm, too prolonged, a demonstration of dominance masked as friendliness. Adrian felt old scars on Marcus's knuckles, traces of numerous fights. "A hard day for all of us." Adrian nodded, freeing his hand. His palm burned from the crushing grip. He stepped back, instinctively creating physical distance between himself and this man whose energy was too large, too aggressive for enclosed space. Caroline took him by the elbow with gentle insistence, guiding him toward the foot of the broad staircase that rose from the foyer, curving in a graceful arc to the upper floor. Her fingers on his arm were cool even through the fabric of his jacket. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice lowering to a confidential whisper, as if sharing a secret rather than delivering the official version of death. "About what happened to Beatrice." Adrian stopped, his gaze traveling up the gentle steps covered in plush burgundy carpet. The staircase was wide, comfortable, each step deep enough for a steady stride. The banister of solid oak had been polished by decades of touch to satin smoothness. "The doctors say she got dizzy," Caroline continued, her eyes studying his face, seeking reaction. "She just stumbled here, at the top step. Instant. She didn't suffer." The words hung in the air, demanding acceptance. Adrian stared at the staircase, his analytical mind automatically cataloging details. Gentle angle of ascent, wide steps, soft carpeting that provided traction, solid handrail at arm level. He remembered Beatrice, a tall, bony woman who even at 82 moved with careful, predatory grace, planning each step. She was not one who just stumbled. "Got dizzy," he repeated slowly, tasting the words. They were bland, unconvincing. "Yes," Caroline squeezed his arm consolingly. "Age, you understand. Blood pressure. The heart." The lie was neatly constructed, each element supporting another, creating a story the police wouldn't challenge. An elderly woman. An accident in her own home. Regrettable, but statistically predictable. But to Adrian, whose profession consisted of reading between the lines of historical documents, detecting inconsistencies between official versions and hidden truth, every word Caroline spoke sounded like a poorly rehearsed line. His reflections were shattered by a piercing, almost human scream that tore through the heavy silence of the parlor. "Silver comb!" Adrian whirled so sharply his glasses slid to the tip of his nose. In the far corner of the room, by the tall windows, loomed an enormous cage of tarnished bronze, an architectural monstrosity with domes and turrets, more resembling a model of a Gothic cathedral than housing for a bird. Inside, on a thick perch, sat Cortez. The blue and gold macaw was enormous, his plumage once bright as a tropical sunset, now slightly faded. Around his intelligent bead black eyes, the feathers had worn thin, giving him the appearance of a wise, weary witness. The bird ruffled his feathers, inflating to even greater size, and his beak, massive and curved, opened again. "Silver comb! Silver comb!" Marcus crossed the room in 3 heavy strides, grabbed a white napkin from the side table, and hurled it over the cage. The fabric covered the bars, muting the light. Cortez issued an indignant screech and fell silent. "Damned bird," Marcus muttered, returning. "Been spouting nonsense all day." Beatrice spoiled it, letting it shriek whatever it wanted. Caroline smirked, a quiet sound devoid of mirth. "He repeats fragments of phrases, meaningless noise. The vet said it's common behavior in old parrots after an owner's death. Stress." They returned to their conversation, dismissing the bird as irritating background noise. But Adrian stood frozen. "Silver comb."
2 words, shouted with perfect clarity, struck his consciousness with the force of physical impact. His hand automatically rose to the side pocket of his satchel where his notebook lay. He remembered Beatrice's family heirloom, a massive silver comb with delicate Spanish engraving that she wore in her gray hair, arranged in a severe crown. He'd seen it in every photograph, during every visit. It wasn't merely an accessory. It was a symbol of her unyielding dignity, part of her very self. Cortez wasn't producing meaningless noise. He was giving testimony. Adrian exhaled slowly, controlling his expression. His academic training, years spent in archives, had taught him to conceal excitement upon discovering an important document. Never show eagerness. Never reveal that you've found something valuable. He turned to Caroline, his face neutral, almost indifferent. "When will the appraiser arrive?" he asked quietly. "Tomorrow at 10 in the morning," Caroline answered. Her smile widened, pleased by the practicality of the question. "We want to settle this as quickly as possible. The house needs to be cleared by the end of the month." Marcus nodded, his massive arms crossed over his chest. "No point dragging it out. All this old junk needs to be cataloged, appraised, and sold off. Time is money." Adrian nodded slowly, as if agreeing. But inside his mind, a plan was already forming. He had less than 24 hours. Tomorrow the appraiser would arrive, and any evidence, any inconsistencies would be swept away, catalogued, packed, and sold. The history of the Belmont estate would be rewritten by the victors, those who would inherit the land and money. He could no longer remain a passive observer, an academic who studies events at the safe distance of centuries. He had to use his historian's skills here, now, while the evidence remained intact. "I'd like to be alone for a bit," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I need to process all this." Caroline nodded, her face radiating understanding. "Of course. Your room is ready upstairs. First door on the right." Marcus clapped him on the shoulder, again too hard, too familiar. "Rest up, Professor. We'll discuss details tonight." They turned away from him, returning to their calculations, their plans for division. Adrian stood for another moment, his gray-green eyes sliding across the parlor. Now he looked at it not as a relative, but as a detective at a crime scene. Every object in this room was a potential witness. Marcus and Caroline stepped out onto the veranda, their voices drifting back muffled, discussing strategy for negotiations with the lawyer. Adrian remained alone. He slowly circled the parlor's perimeter, his steps quiet, cautious. His hands, habitually clasped behind his back, a posture he assumed in museums and libraries, trembled slightly. His gaze slid over surfaces, seeking not something specific, but anomalies, disruptions of order, traces of violence in the ordered chaos of the Victorian parlor. A massive mahogany dresser stood against the wall between 2 portraits, a man in Confederate military uniform and a woman with cold eyes holding a fan. The dresser's surface was covered with small objects, porcelain figurines, a silver box, a stack of yellowed letters tied with ribbon. But it wasn't the objects that drew Adrian's attention. He dropped to his knees, pretending to retie his shoelace. From this angle, positioned at floor level, he saw what was invisible from standing height. The Persian rug at the dresser's feet lay unevenly, with an obvious wrinkle. The edge was turned up, exposing the dark parquet beneath. And on the polished wood, not covered by dust, fresh scratches were clearly visible. Deep grooves carved by heavy furniture someone had recently moved. Adrian felt his heart accelerate. Someone had moved this massive dresser, and moved it with force, in haste, carelessly. His fingers slid to the edge of the rug, lifting it slightly, investigating. "What are you sniffing around for, Professor?" Marcus's voice struck from above, heavy and mocking. Adrian flinched, his head jerking upward. Marcus stood over him, blocking the light from the window, his massive figure casting a shadow that covered Adrian like a shroud.
Looking for something to slip into your bag when nobody's watching?
Marcus's voice oozed contempt, each word dripping poison. Adrian slowly rose to his feet, his movements clumsy, defensive. My shoelace came untied." "Shoelace?" Marcus sneered, his pale blue eyes narrowing. He took a step forward, invading Adrian's personal space with the aggression of a predator cornering prey. "Listen, I get it. Professor's salary ain't much. But if you want to pocket something, at least wait till we've sorted through the estate."
The humiliation was methodical, calculated.
For Marcus, this wasn't just interrogation, it was establishing hierarchy. Proof of who the alpha male was. Adrian felt his jaw clench. Years of academic self-control battled with the primitive impulse to fight back. He wasn't a fighter. He'd never been a fighter. But now, staring into Marcus's mocking face, he felt the burning shame of his own helplessness.
"I'm not stealing anything,"
he said, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "Then why are you digging around by the dresser?" Marcus grabbed him by the collar of his tweed jacket, his fingers digging into the fabric, twisting it. "I asked you a question."
The jerk was sharp, brutal.
Adrian, caught off guard by physical aggression, instinctively thrust his hands forward, palms pressing against Marcus's chest, trying to push him away, create distance. For Marcus, this feeble resistance was an insult, his face contorted with rage, a muscle twitching in his right cheek. He pivoted and shoved Adrian in the chest with both hands, not a punch, but an ejection, full of contempt.
Adrian staggered backward, his long legs tangling in the rug's fold.
He fell awkwardly, his shoulder striking the carved leg of the dresser with a dull thud. Pain lanced through his arm. His glasses flew from his nose, clinking against the parquet. He found himself on his side, his head at floor level, and in that moment, from this unexpected, humiliating vantage point, the muted light from the table lamp caught a dull gleam deep beneath the dresser. There, where the cleaning woman's brush didn't reach, where a standing person's gaze couldn't penetrate. Adrian froze, forgetting the pain. It wasn't dust, not a lost button. It was a piece of silver, curved, decorated with delicate engraving, a broken tooth of the comb. Adrian's heart hammered wildly. His hand, lying on the floor, slowly, imperceptibly slid forward, fingers reaching under the dresser. Marcus stood over him, savoring the humiliation of the professor sprawled on the floor, and this pause gave Adrian crucial seconds. His fingers touched cold metal. He clenched the fragment in his palm, but when his hand moved back, it bumped against something else. Something small, rectangular, with a smooth plastic surface. This object was utterly alien to the world of antique furniture and porcelain figurines. Adrian wrapped his fingers around it and withdrew it along with the silver fragment, clutching both items in his fist. The coldness of plastic and the sharp edge of metal bit into his palm. The pain was sobering. A small, digital voice recorder. Black, featureless, modern. This was the killer's possession, dropped from a pocket during struggle. "Well, Professor, find anything interesting?" Marcus extended his hand, ostensibly to help him up, but his voice was full of mockery. Adrian pretended to brace against the hand to rise. His fist, gripping the discoveries, pressed against the floor. He rose slowly, his face neutral, head slightly lowered so Marcus wouldn't see the flash of understanding in his eyes. "Sorry," he mumbled, bending to retrieve his glasses. "I tripped." Marcus snorted. You'd better be careful. We don't need another accident in this house. The threat was veiled but utterly clear. Adrian nodded without raising his eyes. He turned and moved toward the doors, his gait quick but not running. Every muscle in his body screamed with the desire to escape this room, but he forced himself to walk steadily, calmly. The fist clutching the silver fragment and recorder burned. He climbed the stairs, opened the door to his guest room, and shut himself inside. Only then, leaning his back against the door, did he allow himself to exhale. His hand slowly unclenched. 2 artifacts lay in his palm. One from the past, a tooth from Beatrice's silver comb, broken off in struggle. Physical proof that she had been killed here, in the parlor. The other from the present, a digital recorder that had fallen from the killer's pocket during the scuffle and rolled under the dresser with the evidence. Adrian slowly sank onto the narrow iron bed. His heart pounded, his hands trembled. He placed both items on the threadbare blanket and stared at them for a long time. His morning mission had ended. The investigation had just begun. The iron bed issued a prolonged groan when Adrian settled onto the worn blanket. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from adrenaline still surging through his blood after the confrontation with Marcus. He laid both artifacts before him on the coverlet, the silver fragment of Beatrice's comb and the black digital recorder. The room around him seemed to contract. The low ceiling with its web of cracks pressed down from above. Faded wallpaper with roses the color of dried blood absorbed the light from the single lamp on a rickety side table. The air smelled of mothballs and oblivion, the scent of rooms where people died alone. The single window overlooked the wildest part of the garden, where fern thickets had transformed into impenetrable jungle, hiding the earth from sunlight. Adrian pulled cheap earbuds from his satchel, the kind he usually used for listening to lectures in the archive. His fingers, still stained with remnants of cadmium and ultramarine paint from last week's work restoring an antique document, slid across the smooth surface of the recorder, finding the buttons. He inserted the earbuds. The world vanished. Only the silence of plastic membranes pressed against his eardrums existed, and his own breathing amplified to an asthmatic wheeze. Adrian pressed play, and the space between his ears filled with hissing and crackling, the sounds of a poor recording made in a pocket through layers of fabric. Through the interference, images broke through. First, a woman's voice, high, sharp, full of rage, not fear, rage. Adrian recognized it instantly. Beatrice. Her words drowned in distortion, but the intonation was absolutely clear. She wasn't pleading. She was attacking. Phrases emerged in fragments. Never, you parasite. Beside yourself with your own. Then, a low masculine growl, indecipherable, like the sound of a wild animal cornered. The voice was too distorted by interference to determine whose it was. Marcus? Philip? Someone else? The sound of impact, dull, massive, wood against wood. A table? A door? Adrian strained his hearing to the point of pain, trying to extract every detail from the cacophony of noise. His academic brain automatically catalogued the timbre of the impact, resonance, duration of echo, footsteps. Quick, heavy. Someone moving across the room with furious determination. A sharp, almost melodic chime. A crystal trinket falling on parquet and shattering into fragments. The sound was too elegant for violence, almost beautiful, a dissonance that made Adrian wince. Then, nothing. The recording cut off with a distinct click. Adrian rewound and listened again, and again. With each repetition, the details grew sharper, but the overall picture remained fragmented, incomplete. This wasn't the murder of a cold-blooded killer. This was a brutal, furious quarrel that had spiraled out of control. A clash of two wills where one broke the other.
But the voices were indistinguishable. Any lawyer would tear this recording apart in court. Adrian pulled out the earbuds. The silence of the guest room crashed over him with doubled force. He slipped the recorder into his jacket pocket, feeling its weight over his heart. Material evidence that proved nothing. His gaze slid to the window. Beyond the dirty glass, the garden swayed under the assault of evening wind, ferns bending and whispering to each other in a language he didn't understand. Sleep was pointless. Morning arrived with the cruelty of an inquisitor. Sunlight penetrated the dining room through tall windows, turning dust in the air into golden threads, but this beauty was deceptive. The room smelled of coffee and something else, a faint, barely perceptible aroma of decay, as if beneath the floorboards a rodent corpse lay hidden. Adrian entered last. Marcus sat at the head of the table, not out of respect for hierarchy, but because this position gave him the best vantage for domination. He carved steak with methodical savagery, the knife scraping across the porcelain plate, extracting sounds that set teeth on edge. His pale blue eyes were fixed on the meat, but Adrian understood. Marcus saw him with peripheral vision, tracking every movement. Caroline sat to her brother's right, her back absolutely straight, hands folded on her lap beneath the table. She wasn't eating. Before her stood a cup of tea from which steam rose, but her lips didn't touch the liquid. Philip, her husband, hunched at the opposite end of the table, his shapeless beige cardigan making him resemble a ghost accidentally materialized at breakfast. Adrian took the only available seat, between Caroline and an empty chair where Beatrice had probably once sat. The silence was deafening. Caroline broke it first. She rose with a ballerina's grace, took the silver coffee pot, and slowly circled the table. Her movements were fluid, almost ritualistic. She stopped at Adrian's shoulder, and he felt coldness emanating from her body, as if she were not human, but a sculpture of ice. "Coffee, Adrian?" Her voice was soft, almost maternal. He nodded, not trusting his voice. She poured coffee into his cup, slowly, carefully, not a single drop spilled. Then she set down the pot and sat back. Her gray eyes studied his face with the clinical precision of a surgeon planning an incision. "You didn't sleep at all, dear," she said, each word dripping with concern. "I heard you pacing in your room. The floorboards here are terribly creaky." The threat was veiled as care. "I heard. I'm monitoring. You're under surveillance." Adrian raised the cup to his lips, sipped. The coffee was bitter, scalding. Caroline continued, her tone growing softer, more dangerous. "Perhaps you should return to Chicago? This house. There are too many bad memories here. For you, it must be very difficult being here where the tragedy occurred. We'll manage everything ourselves. The funeral, the paperwork, the appraiser. You don't need to carry this burden." Each word was a surgical instrument, excising him from the situation. Courtesy as weapon, care as exile. Marcus didn't even lift his eyes from the steak, but his lips twisted in the semblance of a smirk. Philip twisted his wedding ring, his watery blue eyes darting between his wife and Adrian like a cornered rabbit. Adrian slowly set the cup on the saucer. The porcelain clinked, too loud in the dining room's silence. "I'm staying," he said quietly. "Beatrice would have wanted me to stay." The air in the room instantly thickened. Caroline froze, her fingers gripping the string of pearls at her neck. Marcus finally raised his head, his gaze meeting Adrian's. Direct collision. Challenge. "Beatrice is dead," Marcus said evenly,
his voice stripped of inflection. She doesn't care anymore. Adrian didn't respond. He stood, pushing back the chair that scraped across the parquet with a prolonged groan, and left the dining room, feeling their gazes on his back. 3 pairs of eyes tracking his movements with predatory attention. The corridor leading to Beatrice's study was long and narrow. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, patterned with twining vines that, in the dim light, resembled serpents crawling toward the door at the passage's end. Beneath Adrian's feet, the parquet creaked with each step, as if warning of his approach. The study door was massive, dark oak, with a brass handle tarnished by time. Adrian extended his hand toward it when a shadow fell across his shoulder. Closed. Marcus's voice struck from such proximity that Adrian flinched. He turned. Marcus stood directly behind him, his massive figure blocking the light from the dining room. He smelled of cologne and whiskey, a scent Adrian was beginning to associate with danger. The lawyer said, "Nothing gets touched before inventory," Marcus continued, crossing his arms over his chest. His posture was relaxed, but sparks of aggression danced in his pale blue eyes. Sealed. Official. It was an obvious lie. There were no seals on the door. Adrian adjusted his glasses with his middle finger, a habitual gesture that gave him a second to think. "I need to retrieve a book I loaned Beatrice," he said, surprised by the calmness of his own voice. "A rare edition. From the university library. I need to return it." Marcus smirked, a sound without mirth. "I'll bring it out." "What book?" "Chronicles of the Conquest of Peru, first edition." "Wait here." Marcus took a step toward the door, his hand settling on the handle as if asserting his authority over the space. Adrian understood. If he allowed Marcus to enter alone, the study would be searched, evidence destroyed. This was a territorial game, and he couldn't lose. Adrian stepped forward, his narrow shoulder colliding with Marcus's chest. "I'll get it myself," he said. Marcus didn't retreat. Instead, his hand shot forward, seizing Adrian's forearm. Fingers clamped with vice-like force, the thumb finding a nerve. Pain flared, sharp, electric. "Listen, Professor," Marcus snarled, leaning closer, his face inches from Adrian's. "Let me explain how the world works. This is our house now, our inheritance. You're a guest here, and guests don't go where they're not invited." Years of academic self-control, the habit of avoiding conflict, the instinctive desire to retreat, all of it collided with a new, unfamiliar feeling. Rage. Adrian didn't push Marcus. Instead, he did what the larger man didn't expect from a weakling. He dropped sharply, slipping from the grip, and dove under Marcus's arm, sliding through the narrow gap between his body and the doorframe. His shoulder struck the solid oak painfully. Air burst from his lungs, but he was inside. Adrian spun and threw his full weight against the door. It began to close. Marcus roared, bracing against it from the opposite side, his face contorted with fury. For a second, they pushed in opposite directions, and Adrian knew he would lose. Strength wasn't on his side. His hand shot to the massive key in the lock. Fingers wrapped around cold metal. He turned. The mechanism's click sounded like a gunshot. The door slammed shut. A deafening blow of fist against oak shook the room. Then another. And another. Marcus pounded on the door with methodical, animal fury, each strike making the hinges tremble. "Open up, you worthless worm!" Marcus's voice was distorted beyond recognition, transformed into the roar of a wounded beast. Adrian leaned his back against the door, his chest heaving. His heart hammered so hard he could hear his pulse in his ears. His hands trembled. The shoulder that had struck the frame throbbed with dull pain.
He had won this skirmish, but the price of victory became clear instantly. He was locked in a room, and outside the door, the pack was gathering. Beatrice's study greeted him with silence, different from the rest of the house. Here, decay didn't reign, but order, an intellectual sanctuary where every object had its place and purpose. The smell of old paper and leather bindings enveloped Adrian, calming his frayed nerves. This was the scent of his true home: archives, libraries, places where truth was preserved between pages. A faint, almost ghostly aroma of pipe tobacco hung in the air, remnant of Beatrice's grandfather, whose portrait hung above the fireplace. Walls from floor to ceiling were covered with bookshelves. Spines with gold lettering formed an ornament of knowledge: history, philosophy, poetry, jurisprudence. Adrian slowly circled the room's perimeter, his fingers sliding over spines, reading titles like prayer. A massive oak desk occupied the center of the space. On its surface reigned perfect order: a stack of books with silk ribbon bookmarks, a heavy silver inkwell, a paperweight of green marble shaped like an owl, and an enormous, battered Bible in leather binding that Beatrice had used as a letterpress, an irony only she would have appreciated. The chair behind the desk, upholstered in dark green leather, still held the indentation of her body. Adrian approached it, ran his palm over the armrest. The material was cool, smooth. His gaze fell on a large silver frame at the desk's edge, a photograph. Adrian picked it up, brought it close to his face. This was a picture from last Christmas. He remembered that day. Beatrice sat in her chair in the parlor, her gray hair arranged in an impeccable crown, the silver comb gleaming in lamplight. Beside her stood Caroline, one hand casually resting on the chair back, the other touching her string of pearls. Her smile was perfect, cold, symmetrical, empty. But it wasn't Caroline who captured Adrian's attention. Philip stood slightly behind, his soft figure in the shapeless cardigan almost dissolving into shadow. But his face... Adrian looked closer. Philip's face was contorted in a strange grimace, not a smile, but something resembling a pained snarl. His watery blue eyes were riveted not to the camera, but to Beatrice's neck, to the pearl necklace she wore that day. His expression was covetous, hungry, and simultaneously full of concealed malice. Adrian slowly lowered the frame to the desk. His brain, accustomed to analyzing historical sources, automatically constructed hypotheses. Quiet, downtrodden Philip, a man he hadn't even considered as a suspect. But perhaps hatred accumulated more intensely in the silent than in those who spilled it outward. The pounding on the door stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Adrian froze, listening. No footsteps. No voices. The corridor beyond the door was utterly silent. This silence was unnatural, tactical. They had stopped raging impulsively. They had begun thinking, and that frightened him more than the screaming. Adrian returned to examining the study, but now every nerve was taut. He moved faster, more feverishly. Time was working against him. His hand slid along the bookshelves, checking each section. Somewhere here, Beatrice's personal papers must be. Her diary. Something that would explain her final days. His fingers encountered a section devoted to Spanish conquistadors. The spines protruded slightly forward, almost imperceptibly, but to his trained eye, the anomaly was obvious. He remembered. Childhood. Playing with Beatrice in this study. She had shown him the old house's tricks, its secrets. Adrian pressed on the thick volume of Prescott's Conquest of Peru. Something clicked beneath his fingers, a mechanism hidden in the wood. The entire section, about 3 feet wide, slid silently aside,
revealing a dark passageway. The smell of dampness and mold poured from the opening, making Adrian grimace. He pulled his phone from his pocket, turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow servants' corridor. Walls were covered in peeling plaster, the floor littered with debris and refuse. Adrian took a step inside. The boards beneath his feet groaned. He directed the light forward. 15 feet from the entrance, the path was blocked by rubble, pieces of broken furniture, a beam, part of a collapsed ceiling. The passage was impassable. He turned, stepped back into the study. The book section closed with a quiet click, once again becoming an innocuous wall of spines. The secret door was useless, but it proved the house had secrets, and Beatrice did too. Adrian returned to the desk. His hands methodically opened drawers, checking contents. Electric bills, store receipts, correspondence with a publisher about publishing her memoirs. All mundane, banal. The bottom drawer was heavier than the others. When Adrian pulled the handle, the mechanism creaked as if it hadn't been opened in a long time. Inside lay a bundle of old bills tied with twine. He lifted the bundle, feeling its weight. Too heavy for ordinary papers. He untied the twine. Bills scattered across the desk, and from beneath them slipped a thin white envelope. No address, no stamps, just a sealed envelope of expensive paper. Adrian opened it with a letter opener. Inside was a single sheet, a bank statement printout. The header read, Royal Bank of Scotland, Georgetown Branch, Cayman Islands. Account holder, Beatrice Vance Thornton. Balance, $10,247,583. 42. Adrian sat. The world swayed. The numbers blurred before his eyes, then refocused, becoming even sharper, even more impossible. $10 million. All of Beatrice's ostentatious asceticism, her contempt for materialism, her caustic comments about the family's greed, all of it had been a masquerade. Or not. Adrian stared intently at the statement date. January 15th, 2026. A month ago. The account was active. His brain, accustomed to analyzing historical puzzles, began constructing theories. Beatrice had accumulated a fortune, perhaps from investments, from land sales, from anything. She had hidden it from the family, from everyone. Why? To protect the money from the vultures? Or to use it as a weapon in a final game? All of them now, Marcus, Carolyn, Philip, knew or at least suspected the size of the fortune. Each had a motive. Marcus needed money to cover his debts. Carolyn needed it to maintain her social standing. Even quiet Philip could see in those millions a chance to finally break free from his wife's heel. Adrian held the statement in his hands, the numbers throbbing before his eyes. $10 million. He saw more than figures. He saw the end of scrambling for grants, begging for $10,000 at a time to fund his research. The end of rental apartments with leaking pipes. The end of his father's contemptuous looks from a man who thought an academic career was a sign of weakness. He saw freedom. His own house, a dream library, the chance to devote himself to genuine scholarship without chasing fashionable articles just to get published. A voice in his head, quiet, rational, convincing, whispered, "What if you just find that money and walk away? Forget the murder, forget justice, forget Beatrice. She's dead. She doesn't care anymore. But you're alive, and you deserve it more than they do." Adrian stared at the statement, And in that moment, he understood Marcus. Caroline. Even Philip. The temptation was almost physical, sweet, nearly irresistible. His fingers began to roll the page into a tube, an instinctive gesture to hide it, keep it, claim it. Then he caught his reflection in the glass of the bookcase. A pale face, tousled hair, glasses sliding down his nose, and eyes, gray-green, swampy, regarding him with an expression he did not recognize. Greed. He looked like one of them. Adrian exhaled sharply, forcing air from his lungs as if expelling poison. He carefully flattened the statement, slipped it back into the envelope, and tucked it into his breast pocket. Not for himself. For the case. For the truth. Because if he took that money, if he let temptation win, he would become the murderer of Beatrice's memory, the only person who had believed he was better than this. The silence beyond the door became absolute. Adrian stepped closer, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, not even breathing. The hallway was empty, or seemed that way. His hand closed around the key. He turned the mechanism slowly, almost soundlessly. The click of the unlocking bolt rang out like a gunshot. Adrian froze, bracing for a reaction. Silence. He opened the door a fraction. A thin strip of corridor came into view. Empty. He pulled it wider. They were standing about 30 feet away, in a single line. Marcus in the center, his heavy arms folded over his chest. Caroline to the right, her face an icy mask of perfect control. And Philip to the left, pale and frightened, but present. They didn't shout, didn't threaten. They just looked at him. Their gazes were the same. Cold. Appraising. Stripped of anything human. In that instant, Adrian understood his fatal mistake. He'd been hunting one killer. But his persistence, his forcing his way into the study, his obvious discovery, had turned them from rivals into a single organism. A pack defending a shared secret. They were no longer a family divided by greed. They were predators united by danger. Marcus smiled slowly. The smile never reached his eyes. "Find your book, Professor?" Adrian stood in the doorway of Beatrice's study, fingers whitening on the frame. The envelope with the bank statement seared his skin through his breast pocket. The silver comb fragment and the recorder lay in other pockets. 3 artifacts, 3 keys to a truth that could either save him or end up carved on his epitaph. He was completely isolated, 1 against 3, in a house that had shifted from museum to prison, and the night still lay ahead. The guest room had turned into an improvised crime lab. Adrian laid the evidence out on the floor with the methodical care of an archaeologist cataloging finds. The Cayman Islands bank statement, $10 million pulsing on the page like an open wound. The Christmas photograph, where Philip watched Beatrice's pearls with a predator's hunger. The notebook, filled with his cramped handwriting, where he recorded every phrase Cortez had uttered, trying to find a pattern. "Silver comb! Under the third moon! Give it back to me!" The phrases refused to weave into a coherent narrative. They were shards, splinters of someone else's conversation, overheard through the wall of time. Adrian sat on the floor, his back against the iron bed frame. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, but intellectual excitement outweighed physical discomfort. He raked a hand through his hair, trying to think like Beatrice. She had been theatrical, cynical, obsessed with the classics and symbolism. For her, life was a chess game where every move carried 3 layers of meaning. Under the third moon, Adrian nudged his glasses up with his middle finger, gray-green eyes narrowing in concentration. The obvious first thought, a calendar. The third full moon of the year, the third day of the week. But that was too simple, too crude for a woman who quoted Ovid over breakfast.
He rose and began pacing the room, 5 steps forward, 5 steps back. His narrow frame cast a long shadow on the faded wallpaper with its dried blood roses. The floor creaked beneath his feet, every sound thunderous in the house's nocturnal silence. Metaphor. Beatrice always spoke in metaphors. His gaze dropped to the stack of books he'd managed to rescue from the study before being thrown out. He dropped to his knees and sifted through the volumes. A History of American Garden Design. Myth and Landscape. Renaissance Art in Colonial Florida. The last book. He remembered leafing through it with Beatrice last summer. She'd sat in her study chair, her bony finger gliding over photographs of statues as she told him the story of each sculpture in the estate's garden, with the enthusiasm other people reserved for their children. Adrian opened the book. The pages smelled of old paper and mold. He flipped quickly, ink-stained fingers leaving faint smudges in the margins. A chapter on garden sculpture. Photos of marble nymphs, satyrs, gods, and goddesses frozen in eternal poses among overgrowth. And there it was, a photograph of the Diana statue. Their statue. He recognized it instantly, one arm broken at the elbow, marble streaked with moss and stains. But in this old photograph, taken probably in the 1930s, the statue was pristine. The caption beneath the image made his heart skip. A rare Hecate Diana statue with triple visage, depicting the goddess in her 3 aspects: celestial, moon; terrestrial, the hunt; and chthonic, the underworld. Note the 3 faces set at different angles, symbolizing the 3 phases of the moon. 3 faces, 3 moons. Under the third moon. Adrian froze, clutching the book in shaking hands. Euphoria sliced through him with physical force. The moment of eureka, the purest pleasure he had ever known. Isolated facts snapped into an elegant, coherent pattern. Beatrice hadn't been talking about a calendar. She'd been talking about a statue. About a specific place. Beneath the Diana statue, at her third face, something was hidden. Money? Evidence? A will? He shut the book and hugged it to his chest like a Bible. His lips pulled into a rare, crooked smile, the smile of someone who has cracked the code. The intellectual triumph was sweet, intoxicating, almost erotic. Beatrice had left him a key. And he had found it. Hunger drove him from the room. The hall clock chimed 7, dinner time. Adrian descended the creaking staircase, his shoes barely touching the steps. The smell of fried fish filled the house, mingling with melted butter and something citrus, lemon or lime. He stopped in the dining room doorway. Marcus, Carolyn, and Philip sat at the table. Before each lay a steaming plate, golden-crusted sea bass fillet, green beans on the side, wedges of lemon. Silverware chimed softly against porcelain. Glasses of white wine caught the chandelier's light. Adrian's place was empty. Not just empty, the chair itself was gone, as though it had never existed at that table. He stood in the threshold, his long shadow stretching across the floor, and no one looked up. Marcus carved his fish with solemn focus, the knife scraping across the plate. Caroline lifted a forkful of beans to her lips, her movements elegant, almost balletic. Philip hunched over his food, twisting his wedding ring, a nervous tick betraying his discomfort. Adrian cleared his throat. Silence. He took a step into the room. The floorboard groaned under his weight, a roar in the quiet. Caroline raised her glass, sipped her wine. Her gray eyes drifted past him as if he were a ghost, transparent, non-existent. "Excuse me," Adrian said softly. "Did I miss dinner?" Marcus sliced another piece of fish. He ate, chewed, swallowed. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on his plate. This was no oversight. It was strategy. They weren't just denying him food. They were stripping him of status, turning him into someone invisible, unacknowledged, a man who could be erased from family history by a single act of collective disregard. Adrian stood there another minute, arms hanging at his sides. Humiliation crawled over his skin in hot waves, painting his pale cheeks with unhealthy color. Part of him, the academic, rational part, recognized the tactic. Psychological warfare. Isolation as a weapon. They meant to break his will, to make him feel so alien he would leave on his own. Another part, more primitive, childlike, wanted to scream, to demand acknowledgement, to hurl a plate against the wall. He did neither. Instead, he turned and walked out. His steps down the corridor were quick, almost a run. He returned to his room and locked the door, leaned his back against it, chest heaving. Hunger stopped mattering. An hour later came the knock. Adrian opened the door a crack. Caroline stood in the hallway, wrapped in a gray cashmere cardigan, her blonde hair still pinned in a flawless chignon. The string of pearls at her throat caught the weak light. Her expression was concerned, perfectly calibrated, thoroughly rehearsed concern. "Adrian," her voice was soft, maternal. "May I come in? We need to talk." He stepped aside. Caroline entered, her gaze sweeping over the chaos on the floor, scattered papers, open books, notebooks. Something flickered in her eyes. Alarm? Calculation? She sat on the edge of the bed, ankles neatly crossed, the posture of impeccable breeding. Adrian remained by the door, hands clasped behind his back. "I'm sorry you didn't join us for dinner," Caroline began. Her fingers rose to her pearls, gliding slowly along the smooth beads. "We didn't mean to hurt you. It's just, Marcus felt the family needed time alone to discuss practical matters." The lie was wrapped carefully and tied with a ribbon of concern. "I understand," Adrian said. Caroline paused, studying his face. "Adrian, we're all going through a difficult time. Beatrice's death, it's a shock for all of us. But your being here, it keeps reopening the wound. You keep asking questions, going through her things, creating tension." She rose and stepped closer. Her hand settled on his forearm, touch cold even through the tweed. "We've booked you on an early flight back to Chicago," she said. Her tone didn't waver, still soft, still coaxing. 7 a.m. A car will be waiting. We've taken care of everything. You can go back to your life, to your work. Please don't make this harder for everyone." It wasn't a request. It was a deportation order dressed in the language of care. Adrian looked into her cold, resolute face. He saw no trace of doubt in her eyes. Her decision had been made. He was an anomaly to be removed from the equation. 7 a.m., he repeated quietly. "Yes." Caroline squeezed his arm, then released it. "It's for the best, dear. Trust me." She left, closing the door with a soft click. Adrian was alone again. He moved to the window and stared into the garden's darkness.
The rain had begun, a fine drizzle, turning the world into a blurred watercolor. He had one night left. Either he found proof before dawn, or his story ended in disgraceful exile. The hall clock struck midnight. Adrian listened to the house. The creak of floorboards had faded. Voices were gone. The estate sank into sleep, or into something like sleep, where walls breathed and shadows moved. He dressed warmly, tweed jacket, and over it an old wool cardigan he'd found in the closet. He slipped his phone into his pocket, flashlight turned on. The recorder and silver comb fragment stayed in another pocket, talismans to remind him of his purpose. He eased open his door. The hallway was empty, lit only by moonlight seeping through the windows. Adrian moved toward the stairs, planning each step, choosing boards that wouldn't creak. His academic clumsiness had become caution, almost grace born of necessity. Downstairs he crossed the dark kitchen. The air smelled of yesterday's coffee and something sour. In the closet under the stairs he found garden tools, a rusty hand trowel with a wooden handle, several gloves riddled with holes. He took the trowel. The metal felt cold, oddly calming in his hand. The back door opened with a long groan. Adrian froze, listening. Silence. He slipped outside. The night garden received him like hostile ground. Drizzle turned the air into a chill suspension of droplets. The earth sucked at his shoes, grass slick beneath his feet. He aimed his phone's light into the darkness, carving a path through ferns the size of his torso, vines hanging from branches like nooses, roots swelling across the paths. Scents sharpened in the dark. Damp. Rotting leaves. Something sweet and nauseating. Perhaps a decomposing animal in the undergrowth. Sounds grew louder, too. Rain tapping on foliage, something rustling in the brush. The distant cry of a night bird slicing the air and then vanishing. Adrian felt like an intruder. A city man, a professor of archives and libraries, trespassing into a primordial world that obeyed other laws. The Diana statue stood about 50 yards from the house, deep in the thicket. Adrian pushed toward it, his shoes sinking in mud, branches whipping his face. The rain intensified, cold rivulets sliding down his neck. He nearly collided with the statue. Marble rose from the dark like a specter. Diana stared at him with blank eyes, her face distorted by rain and shadow. One arm was broken at the elbow, the other stretched forward as if begging or warning. Moss cloaked her body in a green shroud. Dark streaks down the marble looked like dried blood. Adrian lowered the beam to the pedestal. The roots of an ancient magnolia coiled around the base, thick, twisting forms like snakes. He circled slowly, counting the goddesses' faces. The first looked east, the second south, the third west. Beneath the third face, the soil seemed different, looser, the grass sparser. Someone had dug here, recently. His heart pounded faster. He knelt in the mud. Cold and wet soaked through his trousers at once, but he barely noticed. He raised the trowel and began to dig. The earth yielded too easily, far too easily for Florida clay. He worked feverishly, driven by equal parts fear and hope. Rain hammered harder, turning the pit into a murky puddle. His polished city shoes were now sodden clumps of mud. Water streamed down his face, mingling with sweat. The trowel struck something solid. The sound was dull and metallic, the sweetest music he had ever heard. Adrian flung the tool aside and clawed at the muck with his hands. Fingers long trained for the delicate handling of ancient manuscripts, now scooped cold, viscous earth with frantic fury. He didn't feel the cold, didn't feel the rain. Only the goal existed. His fingertips brushed cold, slick metal. He wrapped both hands around the object and pulled. A box slurped free of the ground. It was small, shoebox-sized, but heavy. Rust and soil coated the metal. The lock was old, thick, stubborn. Adrian held it in his arms, triumph surging through him so fiercely he almost shouted. He had done it. He had found it. The key to the riddle. The proof. The truth. He lifted his head to catch his breath, and the world froze. A few steps away, beneath the spread of a live oak, stood Marcus. He wasn't breathing hard. Didn't look surprised. His massive figure was utterly still, carved from the same stone as the statue. Based on the translation guidelines and story context from your previous work, here is the English adaptation of the final confrontation scene. In his hands he held a full-sized garden spade, not a rusted toy, but a real tool, its metal blade catching the moonlight. His pale blue eyes regarded Adrian without emotion. "Well done, Professor." Marcus's voice was calm, almost friendly. "You did all the dirty work for me." He took a step forward. Mud squelched beneath his boot. "Now hand it over." Adrian clutched the box to his chest, struggling to his feet. His shoes slipped in the muck as he barely kept his balance. "No," Marcus smirked. "You really think you have a choice?" He moved forward, not quickly, but inexorably. Adrian backed away, but the magnolia roots blocked his path. He stumbled, dropped to one knee. Marcus loomed over him. The struggle began. It was ugly, primitive, stripped of all nobility. Marcus didn't try to strike. He simply tried to take the box, using his mass and strength. His hands clamped around Adrian's wrists, squeezing with painful force. Adrian twisted, slid through the mud, trying to wrench free. They fell together, rolling through wet earth. Rain lashed their faces. Mud clogged mouths, noses, eyes. Adrian choked, his lungs desperately gulping air. Marcus was stronger, much stronger. He pinned Adrian to the ground, his knee driving into Adrian's chest. Air escaped his lungs with a wheeze. Marcus's fingers closed around the box, trying to tear it away. In that moment, Adrian understood. If he lost now, they would simply crush him, kill him, write it off as an accident. He used the only weapon he had, his brain. Instead of resisting, he suddenly shoved the box directly into Marcus's hands. Marcus, not expecting this, instinctively grabbed it with both hands, momentarily releasing the pressure on Adrian's chest. In that fraction of a second, Adrian scooped a full handful of liquid mud and hurled it into Marcus's face. The roar was deafening. Marcus reeled back, blindly rubbing his eyes. Adrian snatched the box back and lunged sideways, stumbling, falling, but keeping his prize. He ended up several yards from Marcus, trembling with adrenaline and cold. His hands, covered in mud and scratches, gripped the box so tightly his knuckles went white. Now or never. Adrian tried to open the lock. The rusted mechanism wouldn't budge. He pulled harder. Nothing. In desperation, he raised the box overhead and slammed it against a large stone at the statue's base. The lock broke with a crunch. The lid sprang open. Adrian stared inside, his breath frozen in his throat. Empty. The box was absolutely, hopelessly empty. On the faded velvet lining, like a mockery, lay a single, neatly folded slip of paper. No money, no documents, no proof, nothing. His entire investigation, all the risk, all the pain, it had all led to this empty box. Adrian's hands trembled. He unfolded the note. Rain blurred the ink, but he managed to read Beatrice's elegant, familiar script. "I knew you would come, my boy, but you're looking for the wrong thing." In that moment, loud, triumphant laughter rang out. Marcus stood wiping mud from his face with his sleeve. His features twisted into a grimace of jubilation, the muscle in his jaw twitching. He laughed, loudly, almost hysterically, the sound echoing through the night garden. "Did you really think she left a treasure?" he roared between bursts of laughter. "Did you really think she was stupid enough to bury money in the dirt? Idiot! She was as broke as the rest of us. 10 million! It's fiction! Fantasy!" A chill went through Adrian to his bones, and it wasn't the chill of rain. Light blazed, flooding the garden with harsh, merciless illumination. Floodlights in the house terrace ignited, lighting the scene with theatrical clarity. On the threshold stood Caroline and Philip. Caroline wore an impeccable gray robe, her hair still pinned in a perfect chignon. Philip huddled beside her, his shapeless cardigan hanging like a sack. They stared at Adrian, at him, soaked, smeared with mud from head to toe, kneeling in a puddle, clutching an empty, rusted box. His glasses had slipped to the tip of his nose, one lens cracked. His tweed jacket had become a filthy rag, hair plastered to his forehead. He didn't look like an investigator, not like a defender of truth. He looked like a pathetic, deranged thief digging up the garden in search of non-existent treasure. A madman. In Caroline's eyes, he saw cold triumph. Her lips curved into the semblance of a smile, barely perceptible, but absolutely genuine. She had won. His entire theory, his entire investigation, his entire struggle collapsed. He was completely discredited. Who would believe a man who digs graves at midnight in the rain? Who would believe his accusations? No one. Adrian lowered his head, staring at the empty box in his hands. Rain drummed on the metal, creating a monotonous, funeral rhythm. The game was over. Marcus's hand, massive, hot with rage, struck Adrian between the shoulder blades with such force he stumbled over the threshold. His wet shoes slipped on the polished parlor floor, and he barely stayed on his feet, grabbing the doorframe. The empty box slid from his fingers, fell with a dull metallic thud, and rolled toward the piano leg, leaving a trail of muddy water. The light was cruel. The chandelier crystals exploded in thousands of sharp glints, turning the parlor into a surgical theater where every detail of his disgrace was illuminated with clinical precision. Adrian raised his hand to wipe mud from his face and saw his reflection in the dark mirror above the fireplace. The sight was annihilating. His tweed jacket, once a symbol of academic respectability, had become a shapeless rag soaked with rainwater and Florida mud. His corduroy trousers clung to his legs, covered in dark stains and streaks. One lens of his glasses was cracked, a spider web of fine lines radiating from the center, distorting his view of the world. Hair stuck to his forehead in wet strands, dirt packed under his nails. He didn't look like an investigator solving a crime. He looked like a lunatic digging up graves in search of phantom treasure. Caroline and Philip stood by the fireplace, like two columns framing the entrance to a temple. She, immaculate in her gray cashmere robe, hair still pinned in a perfect chignon, pearls at her throat, reflecting the chandelier's light with cold brilliance. He, hunched, head drawn into his shoulders, his shapeless cardigan hanging like a sack. They looked at Adrian with identical expressions. Not anger, not surprise. Cold, calculating triumph.
Marcus entered behind him, slamming the door. The click of the lock sounded with the finality of a judicial sentence. He positioned himself at the exit, arms folded across his chest, a guard blocking the only path to retreat. Rainwater streamed from his broad shoulders onto the floor, forming a puddle. His pale blue eyes gleamed with excitement, the muscle in his jaw twitching in rhythm with his accelerated breathing. Adrian slowly straightened. His ribs ached from the blow received in the struggle. Each breath sent pain through his chest. He ran his tongue over his lips, tasted the metallic flavor of blood. Somewhere in the scuffle, he'd bitten his cheek. "Have a seat, Professor." Marcus's voice was almost friendly, almost cheerful. He pointed to a chair in the middle of the room, an antique with a straight back, standing apart from the other furniture like a throne for interrogation. "You look tired." Adrian didn't move. Caroline took a step forward. Her movements were smooth, measured, as though she'd rehearsed this scene for decades. Her fingers slid along the string of pearls, slowly, methodically, counting the beads one by one. It was her nervous tick, a way to maintain control when triumph raged inside. "I'm sorry, Adrian," she said, and her voice, usually quiet and insinuating, filled the room. It sounded loud, distinct, resonating from the high ceiling with its plaster molding. "I'm truly sorry it came to this." She stopped 2 paces from him. The scent of her perfume, expensive, floral, suffocatingly sweet, mixed with the smell of mud and rain emanating from Adrian. The contrast was insulting. "Your obsession," Caroline paused, letting the word hang in the air, "has crossed all boundaries of propriety. We've been patient. We've shown understanding. We remember how close you were to Beatrice." Her lips curved into the semblance of a sympathetic smile, but her eyes remained cold and calculating. "But this," she gestured toward the overturned box, the muddy tracks leading from the door to Adrian himself. "This is no longer grief. This is sickness. You've defiled Beatrice's memory with your vulgar greed." The word greed struck Adrian with physical force. That was the exact word Beatrice used to describe everyone around her. That was the vice she'd protected him from all her life. And now they were accusing him, the only one who'd never wanted her money, of the very sin that was their own essence. "The taxi will be here at 7 a.m., Caroline continued. Her fingers squeezed a pearl, holding it between thumb and forefinger. "It will take you to the airport. We've already paid for your ticket to Chicago. If, by that time, you're not in the car—" She turned to Philip and her husband, as if on cue pulled his cell phone from his cardigan pocket. The screen glowed blue in his trembling fingers. "We'll call the police," Caroline finished. "I'm sure the Palm Beach County Sheriff will be extremely interested in the story of a distant relative who digs up private property in the middle of the night, searching for non-existent treasure. A man who breaks into locked rooms, steals documents, attacks family members." The trap was perfect. Every action he'd taken in recent days, legitimate investigation, the search for truth, could be reframed as criminal activity. Any word about Beatrice's death would now sound like the ravings of a paranoiac obsessed with money. Adrian opened his mouth to object, but Caroline raised her hand. The gesture was elegant and implacable. "Please don't humiliate yourself further," she said gently. "We understand. You're tired. You're not yourself. In the morning, when you return to your life, to your books, this will all seem like a bad dream." She turned to Marcus, nodded. The siblings exchanged a glance, brief, silent communication honed by years of family manipulation. Marcus smirked. 7 a.m., Professor, he repeated, squaring his shoulders. His figure filled the doorway, blocking the exit. Don't be late. We don't want to create a scene. He pushed away from the door, crossed the room with a heavy, proprietary gait. Each step made the floor groan. He stopped beside Cortez's cage, which stood by the window, its gilded bars reflecting the chandelier's light. The parrot had been silent until this moment. He sat on his perch, hunched, his bright blue and yellow plumage the only spot of color in this room, filled with gray shadows and cold light. His black bead eyes observed the proceedings with the impassivity of an ancient judge. Marcus rapped his knuckles against the bars. The metal rang out sharply, insultingly loud. Cortez flinched, flapped his wings, but made no sound. "Look, bird," Marcus said loudly, addressing the parrot, but his words were aimed at Adrian. "Your defender turned out to be a common thief, a night digger, a grave digger of non-existent treasures." He laughed, loudly, almost barking. The sound filled the parlor, bounced off walls upholstered in dark silk, off portraits of ancestors staring down in mute condemnation. It was the laugh of triumph, the laugh of a man who has won and knows it. Adrian stood in the middle of the room, his arms hanging at his sides. Wet clothes clung to his skin, cold penetrated deep to his bones. But physical discomfort was nothing compared to what he felt inside. Complete, crushing defeat. His entire investigation, methodical gathering of facts, deciphering clues, the intellectual triumph of solving the statue's riddle, had all led to an empty box and a note that mocked his efforts. "You're looking for the wrong thing." Beatrice seemed to be taunting him even after death. Marcus turns to him, his broad face flushed with excitement. The muscle in his jaw twitched in time with his breathing, a physical sign of his adrenaline, his animal pleasure in domination. "You know, Professor," he said, leaning forward, invading Adrian's personal space. "When the old witch died, I thought, finally we'll get what's owed to us. But even in death, she decided to mock us. 10 million. He laughed again, shaking his head. That was her final joke, making us believe, making us search, making us... He broke off, his gaze falling on the empty box. Something flickered in his eyes, not doubt, but irritation, the sting of an old wound. "And the truth is, there was never any money," he finished more quietly. "She was as broke as the rest of us, maybe even poorer." He turned to Cortez's cage, his movements becoming sharp, nervous. Triumph began transforming into rage, uncontrolled, impulsive rage of a man who'd felt cheated his entire life.
"Well, old chatterbox?"
Marcus shouted, his face nearly pressed against the bars. Cortez hopped to the far end of the perch, his feathers standing on end. "What do you have to say now? Where's your mistress? Where are her treasures? Where's her wisdom?" His voice grew louder, breaking into a scream. Philip shrank back against the wall. Even Caroline retreated slightly, her fingers clutching the pearl necklace. "The truth is, there's no money!" Marcus roared, his face crimson, veins bulging in his neck. "Give me the truth. Give it back, you old witch. Give it back to me." He screamed the last words with such force that the chandelier's crystal pendants trembled in the room. His voice cracked with rage and despair, with the helpless fury at a dead woman who, even after death, continued to control his life. This wasn't just mockery of the parrot. This was a reenactment of trauma, an uncontrolled outpouring of the very anger Marcus had screamed at Beatrice in the final minutes of her life. His body remembered that moment, the tension of muscles, adrenaline in his blood,
the desperate hunger for power and money. Silence hung in the room. Cortez tilted his head sideways, his black eye, unblinking, dispassionate, fixed on Marcus. The parrot opened his beak and spoke. But the voice that emerged from his beak was not the raspy caw of a bird. It was a human voice, female, crystal clear, with that slight huskiness that made it unforgettable. Low, mocking, absolutely calm. Beatrice's voice. "And then, my clever Cortez, when he asks what you heard, you'll say, 'Marcus, it was Marcus.'"
Every word was pronounced with perfect articulation, with the same intonation with which Beatrice read her favorite classics aloud. This wasn't imitation. This was a recording, played back with the precision of a digital device by a living, breathing creature. The phrase rang out in the dead silence of the parlor, not as a random collection of sounds, but as a direct message, an answer to the killer's question, an accusation spoken from beyond the grave. Time stopped. Adrian felt his heart freeze in his chest, then beat with such force he heard his pulse in his ears. His mind, attuned to analyzing historical evidence, instantly captured every detail of this moment. Marcus froze. His broad face, seconds ago red with rage, began to pale. The smirk slid from his lips, leaving his mouth hanging open in mute shock. His hands, gripping the cage bars, slowly unclenched. He staggered back a step, then another, his massive body swaying. Carolyn made a quiet, strangled sound. Not a scream, not a moan. Something in between. Her hand flew to her mouth, covering it with her palm. Her gray eyes widened, pupils reduced to dark points against the whites. The pearl necklace she'd been worrying throughout the scene slipped from her fingers and hung against her chest. Philip leaned his back against the wall, his knees buckling. He slowly slid down, ending up sitting on the floor, his shapeless cardigan riding up to expose his rumpled shirt beneath. His face turned ashen. Everyone stared at the cage. Cortez, as if conscious of the significance of the moment he'd created, calmly turned on his perch, presenting his back. He began preening a feather on his wing. A mundane, routine action, absolutely incompatible with the fact that seconds ago he'd pronounced a death sentence. The silence was deafening. Adrian heard the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, slow, methodical, counting off seconds in the shattered world of the Thornton family. He heard Marcus's breathing, rapid, shallow, as though he'd sprinted. He heard water dripping somewhere in the house, the metallic sound of droplets falling into a sink. His own mind worked with incredible speed. The empty box. The note. "You're looking for the wrong thing." The parrot, who doesn't mimic random sounds, but reproduces a pre-recorded, carefully rehearsed phrase. A phrase that is a direct response to Marcus's words. Everything fell into place with mathematical precision. This wasn't a treasure hunt. It had never been a treasure hunt. Beatrice hadn't hidden money. She'd hidden justice. She used their greed as bait. She created the legend of millions in the Caymans, knowing it would make them behave predictably. She left clues, knowing that Adrian, and only Adrian, could decipher them. She buried an empty box, knowing it would lead to confrontation. And she trained Cortez with the final phrase, knowing that Marcus, in his triumph and rage, wouldn't be able to stop himself from screaming exactly those words. Words he'd screamed at her before the murder. This was theater. A grand, cruel, perfectly choreographed play in one act. And Adrian wasn't the detective. He was the bait, the catalyst,
the instrument that forced the killer to reenact the crime before the only witness who couldn't be bribed, intimidated, or killed. Before the parrot. Euphoria pierced Adrian with such force he swayed. His knees barely held his weight. His hands trembled, not from fear or cold, but from pure, intoxicating triumph. Beatrice hadn't abandoned him. She'd never abandoned him. She'd left him not money, which he'd never wanted. She'd left him a weapon. Adrian slowly straightened. The cold of wet clothing no longer mattered. The dirt under his nails, the cracked glasses, the humiliation of recent days all evaporated. He didn't feel like a pathetic treasure hunter, but like what Beatrice had wanted him to be. A victor. He took a step toward the table, his movements slow, deliberate. Each step left a wet mark on the floor. He circled the overturned box, past Marcus, who stood motionless, as if petrified. Adrian reached into the soaked pocket of his tweed jacket. His fingers found cold, hard plastic. He pulled out a small black recorder, the very one he'd found under the dresser on the first day, hidden among dust and fragments of the silver comb. He held it in his palm like a sacred relic. "You're right," Adrian said. His voice was quiet, but in the absolute silence of the room, every word rang out distinctly. He turned to Caroline, then to Marcus, then to the huddled Philip. "The box was empty." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Because Beatrice left me her real inheritance on the very first day. She didn't leave me treasure." His finger settled on the play button. "She left me a weapon." He pressed it. In the silence of the parlor, the hiss of an old recording sounded. Then, chaos captured in sound. Marcus's voice, distorted by rage.
Give it back, you old witch!
The chime of shattered crystal. Something fell from the table, exploded into shards. A dull, meaty thud. The sound of a fist slamming into flesh. Beatrice's short, choked gasp. Not a scream, not a moan. The weak sound of escaping air. A heavy fall. Something soft hitting a hard surface. And then, quiet but distinct, a click. The sound of a plastic object dropping onto carpet. The recording ended in hissing. Adrian turned off the recorder. The silence that followed the playback was absolute. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. He slowly raised his gaze to Marcus. His cousin's face had turned the color of old wax. Sweat beaded on his forehead, trickled down his temples. His lips moved, but produced no sound. His hands clenched into fists, then unclenched, fingers trembling. "She knew you'd come for the money, Marcus," Adrian said. His voice was calm, methodical, the voice of a professor stating historical fact. "She turned on the recorder and provoked you. She knew you'd kill her. And she knew that in the struggle, you'd drop this thing." He raised the recorder higher so everyone could see. "And everything else, the empty box, the clues, the parrot, was just theater, a play staged for one audience member. For you. To make you speak those words again, so there would be no doubt about who killed Beatrice Vance Thornton." Marcus stared first at the recorder in Adrian's hand, then at the parrot, who continued calmly preening his feathers. His world, built on physical strength, on the right of the powerful, on conviction in his own immunity, was collapsing. He'd been defeated not by fists, not by money, not by power. He'd been defeated by the intellect of a dead woman and her final, perfectly calculated move. Marcus took a step back. His boot caught the edge of the very Persian rug that concealed the crime scene. He swayed, flailed his arms trying to regain balance, and fell heavily into Beatrice's chair. The old leather chair accepted his weight with a prolonged sigh. He sat in it, slumped, his massive figure suddenly seeming smaller, as though deflating. His arms hung at his sides. He stared into the emptiness before him with unseeing eyes. Broken. Adrian pulled out his phone from another pocket. The screen was cracked in one corner, evidence of the fall in the garden, but the device worked. His fingers, covered in dried mud, dialed 3 numbers. The connection tones seemed deafeningly loud in the silence. "Palm Beach County Police," came a mechanical female voice. "What is your emergency?" Adrian didn't take his eyes off Marcus. "My name is Adrian Vance. I'm at the San Esperanza estate." His voice was firm and calm. "I want to report a murder. I have a recorded confession and a witness." Caroline made a quiet moan. She looked at Adrian with an expression of pure, helpless hatred. Her perfect world, control, status, the flawless facade of prosperity, was crumbling before her eyes. She reached out to Philip, but her husband didn't respond to the gesture. He sat on the floor, arms wrapped around his knees, his gaze empty. Adrian finished the call with the dispatcher and lowered his phone. Sirens would be here in 15 minutes. 15 minutes until the end of this story. He slowly approached Cortez's cage. The parrot finished preening his wing and turned to him. His black eye, intelligent, ancient, absolutely dispassionate, met Adrian's gray-green gaze. In that moment, Adrian understood why Beatrice had chosen precisely this bird as her final ally. Cortez couldn't lie, couldn't distort, couldn't succumb to emotions or blackmail. He was the perfect keeper of truth, a living, breathing archive whose memory was incorruptible. Adrian reached his hand toward the cage. His fingers touched the cold, gilded bars. "Well," he said quietly, and for the first time in a long while, his lips stretched into a genuine, sincere, though sad smile. "I think today's lecture on oral history can be considered concluded." Cortez tilted his head as if agreeing. Then, to Adrian's surprise, the parrot spoke one more phrase, the last that Beatrice had left for him. Her voice sounded soft, almost tender. "Good boy." Adrian closed his eyes. Tears burned under his lids, not from grief, but from relief, from gratitude, from love for a woman who, even in death, had protected him the only way she could. She hadn't given him money. She'd given him truth and justice. Far off, on the driveway through the tunnel of ancient oaks, blue and red lights began to pierce the darkness. Sirens approached, their wail tearing through the nocturnal silence of Florida. The rain had stopped. Through breaks in the clouds, stars appeared,